And 7.4, Councillor Tejo, regarding the Great Lakes Cities Initiative delegation in Washington. Councillor Tejo was appointed by the former mayor to do the Great Lakes conference, and I said, sure, go ahead, keep doing it. And he won the jackpot this time because it was right in the middle of the whole tariff discussion. So I asked him if he would like to share some of it with us. You got 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I will try to stick to time. And just a quick overview here, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative was created by the mayors of Toronto and Chicago nearly 25 years ago to basically advocate on a number of environmental and economic issues surrounding the Great Lakes. There are now 270 municipalities representing communities along the Great Lakes in the 8 states and the 2 provinces. I also happen to serve on the 12-person board of directors as well for the organization. We'll go down to the next slide. I'm going to try to make this quick. So 2 times a year, there are basically 3 big things that happen. There's an AGM that goes back and forth between the borders. And we have a lobby day in Ottawa, and we have a lobby day in Washington, D.C. Normally, there's only about 10 to 12 people who go to this. This year, 28 mayors and councillors and First Nations leaders from across the basin came to Washington, D.C. And you can see there was pretty strong representation in Quebec from the mayor of Montreal, Quebec City, Laval, and a lot of the great Ontario Big City Mayors Caucus was there as well, and a number of U.S. mayors. On to the next slide. We'll talk about the key priorities because normally, in normal times, and we're not in normal times, we focus on funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which on the next slide we'll see talks about a number of different projects. So we'll go to the next slide right now, where there's significant funding tranches for coastal erosion, for restoration projects, for removing lead, over 8,000 projects funded by the federal government in the United States, $500 million per year. One of the big pushes this time around was to try and maintain this, even though it's already been appropriated by Congress. There is a concern that DOGE will come in and reappropriate or cancel the funding to a number of these projects. So the Americans were, the American mayors and councillors were leading sort of the push on please continue this funding, and also as Congress people, this is your decision. This wasn't sort of the executive. So on to the next slide, we can talk about how it's shifted the day we got there. The day before we got there, a couple of weeks ago, the president re-announced his tariffs, and we've had to alter course in terms of what we were talking about. We weren't no longer talking about the environment and water protection. We ended up talking much, much more about the trade relationship. And the $6 trillion number that you see there is in US dollars, so that's over 8 trillion Canadian dollars. That represents the regional economy of the Great Lakes Basin, which would be the 3rd largest economic area in the entire world. This provides 20% of the fresh water in the entire world and serves over 40 million people. The interesting piece about it here for the local communities that we were trying to get the message across is that, yes, we say that it's 50% of our bilateral trade for Canada, and it's roughly 10% for the U.S. when they break it down in terms of their numbers. But for these states, for these Great Lakes states, it was much, much more. So the impact on them would be much greater than it would be anywhere else in the United States because of how closely integrated they are. So the best part about some of these delegations were the stories that we were able to tell on a local level. Every single district and state had a breakdown of the number of jobs supported by Canadian companies, Canadian trade, and we had the American delegates basically talk about how important those were for them. So on to the next slide. This was sort of the lay of the days that we were there, but we can move on to the next slide, and I'll talk about some of the meetings that we had. So we tried to have a balance of Republicans and Democrats, and we had meetings with every single state that's touched by the Great Lakes. And the Democrats, you can assume, were mostly in line. There were some concerning views around blanket tariffs being favorable as a tool to protect human rights, and I tried to not take offense to that comment, that Canada would need support in maintaining human rights in terms of blanket tariffs. So we were trying to be polite on that front. And what was interesting is a number of the Republican Congress people that we met were sympathetic to the message and understood how this would affect their local communities, but were at a bit of a loss in terms of how they could influence the administration. We were basically asking, what's the end game and how can we help in a different way that isn't, blanket tariffs that would hurt these communities. So on to the next slide. There was a great event where we had a number of speakers. This is where I say is the difference between things happening in public and things happening in private, because there were a couple of Republican senators there from Ohio who happened to mention, these tariffs are important because we need to protect our Americans from fentanyl. And, there was a loud groan in the room. I think in the last 100 days, there's been something like 13 grams of fentanyl being found going into the United States. I brought more toothpaste when I flew over there. So it does seem like some of them are still in that extreme side of messaging from the administration, which was obviously deeply disappointing, but there were some riled up other folks that wanted to defend the position that we were taking. And the next slide. This was also a really important roundtable that we had that brought in a number of the business partners and industry partners that talked about how they don't plan on leaving. If they're Canadian companies doing business in the US or American companies doing business in Canada, they did a survey, 95% of them say they have no intention of moving their factories and their plants and their jobs because it would take billions of dollars of investment and 5, 10, 15 years to fully move up. So they're on board with, removing these tariffs as a matter of course. And the last slide, I believe. And then we had a press conference where each community was sort of talking about it. That's the mayor of Gary, Indiana, and he was great in terms of talking about how much this affects their local community. So I don't want to overemphasize what we did. I think we know we weren't going to change hearts and minds of the administration here, but we were trying to arm the local community leaders, of mayors, of congresspeople, of senators, with the information of how this would affect them and have them take that back as part of their conversations with the administration so that they understand when businesses start closing, when residents start calling them and saying, things aren't working well anymore and the prices of everything is going up and we're losing jobs, that they can point to, oh, this is the information that we got. And now that was, I think, probably the most useful thing we were able to do there, but to also have advocates for this on the American side for us. So happy to take questions. I know I went a bit over time. Thank you.
No, that's okay that you went a bit over time. It didn't bother me at all. It's very important, and I'm very grateful that you did this.